Now, as we look at the therapeutic domain, which in many ways is a last bastion for men in our culture, there is an element of shame, and that continues in the relationship in the unilateral exposure. And I have mixed feelings about therapy as a general context. Timothy Leary did a study that showed that a year later, 30% of people had gotten better, 30% of people had gotten worse, and 30% of people had stayed the same in both the control group and the group doing therapy. And so I think it's healthy to bring to light some of the skepticism, some of the awareness of a man in this state entering into a therapeutic relationship. But if you think about the balance of power in most relationships, if one person does all of the exposing, what do they feel? They feel exposed, sometimes overexposed. And so the very nature of the therapeutic relationship is one of one-way exposure. And so that's one kind of hesitancy, one caution. The other is the potential message that comes from the professional nature of the relationship, which is that in a culture, in a family, in a relationship in which men's feelings are routinely marginalized and taken for granted as being unimportant or non-existent, that the message that you have to drive an hour to someone's house or someone's office and pay them hundreds of dollars just to listen to your feelings and keep them secret is not always a healthy message. And the reason for that is one, it's billed as confidentiality, but another word for confidentiality is secrecy. And you have a certain dissociation in this culturally created relationship, because it is a culturally created relationship. What the culture is saying is, we don't want to teach your parents how to behave as parents. We don't want to teach your teachers how to behave as teachers. We don't want to teach you in school how to be emotionally and traumatically and relationally literate. We don't want to teach you in work how to be emotionally, traumatically, and relationally literate. Therefore, you are going to create a lot of pain. And being the good capitalist culture that we are, we've got a great solution. You can go pay people who have nothing to do with your lives. Let's get it as dissociated as possible. Who have nothing to do with your lives. You can go pay people to listen to your feelings. And they will keep the secret that you have feelings, the secret of what those feelings are, etc., etc. And admittedly, this is a somewhat dark way of looking at therapy. However, it can shed light and validation, the focus here being on the experience of the man, on what it's like to navigate our culture. So you have one-sided exposure, you have paying. Now, there's a very important part in this relationship with this one way of exposure that can be incredibly painful, and I've experienced it myself in my process of doing $150,000 of therapy with a variety of practitioners. And it's the almost certainty that if you do a fair amount of therapy, that there will be failure. What do I mean by that? Well, most of us at one level or another, if we are going to therapy because we're in agony and misery in various points of our illiterate lives, then we're going to a therapist to feel better. And that can happen in a variety of ways. That does not always happen. And this can be for a variety of reasons. A therapist who, surprisingly in my experience, none of the 40 practitioners, I'll call them practitioners because all of them wouldn't be considered therapists, but they're all doing therapy, meaning they're all working with the heart, mind, and the body with the goal of restoring symmetry, of restoring grace, of restoring well-being. And that doesn't always happen. For example, I went into my first acupuncture session, and I was fuzzy and dissociated for 3 days. Now, would anyone go to acupuncture if it was billed as you too can feel fuzzy and dissociated for 3 days? No, it is billed as a healing medicinal process. And certainly nowhere on the brochure and nowhere on the web page did it say, there's a good chance you'll feel dazed, dissociated, and worse for 3 days after your first session. Come on by and pay us $90. No, it's billed as a healing thing. Now, I feel terrible. And I call the acupuncturist and say, I feel terrible. You said I would feel good. I feel terrible. Well, she doesn't say, silly me, I forgot to put that on the website. She doesn't say, I'm so sorry. Here's your money back. I told you you'd feel better. You felt worse. I made a mistake. Here's your money back. No. She says, oh, that happens sometimes as part of the integration process. In other words, no matter what happens, you could develop dual personality. Oh, things are just working through. You could get majorly depressed. Things come up. Whatever happens in the process, it is validation that the healing practitioner is doing their job. Now, this is unique in therapeutic domains, meaning if you as a man have a broken screen on your laptop or your phone and you take it into Best Buy or Radio Shack or some such place, and you say, my screen is broken. How much will it cost to fix my screen? They will give you a price. Now, if you get the laptop back and the screen is still broken, plus the keyboard won't work, you can take this back and say, I'm not paying that bill. What's more, you need to fix the keyboard, and what's more, you're going to get a terrible review if there's any fuss about this. And this is completely understood because we're dealing in the chauvinistic paradigm with physical objects. But because we're dealing with the human psyche, clearly a valueless commodity, the feminine, the psyche, your own heart and mind, because we're dealing with what's inside of you, that which is feminine, this kind of bullshit is unquestioned as long as the people get the money for their service. And having worked with 40 practitioners, I've heard it all. I've been sexually abused under the influence of psychedelics. This did not warrant an apology until a lawsuit was threatened. And then it warranted an apology, but did not warrant a refund. In other words, that just happens sometimes. Sometimes, under the influence of psychedelics, therapists charging $175 an hour sexually abuse their patient. It happens. Perhaps it was meant to be. This therapist felt completely martyred by the idea that he should have to be responsible for the PTSD that induced and blah, 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 blah. Completely out to lunch. It never occurred to the acupuncturist to give a refund. Nor did it occur to the family constellation therapist to repair the first therapist's job, who, when hearing that a fellow therapist was sexually abusing patients, encouraged me to move on and not dwell on it, rather than to champion other sexual abuse survivors who were clearly going to be set up to be the next victim. There's almost a cannibalistic feeding frenzy amongst these therapists where they thrive on your parents' stupidity, on the culture's emotional ignorance. And they all get business. And then they get business from one another. Because when one therapist says something that seems really off to me, I go to another therapist, and they're happy to take money to agree with me that what the other therapist did was wrong. But nothing they did was ever wrong. And having spent $150,000 with 40 practitioners, I can assure you that there has almost never been a case where a therapist has acknowledged that they're wrong. Whether I've felt terrible, whether I've felt great, doesn't matter. And they have a whole host of different things to make sense of this. Shadow integration. Things are working through. Things have to come up before they can be integrated and move on. Sometimes you have to feel worse before you can feel better. Now, one fellow who I paid $90,000 to, I started poking around in his little system because, we were clearing off the energy meridian of the central meridian, anyway, I forget all the names. It's been a year, a couple of years, but there was this meridian. Then there was this meridian off the body. Then there was the governing and central meridian, a classic thing. Oh, we've got to clear this. Well, I started noticing after the years that we were doing the same old thing, that we had cleared governing and central meridian on the body, 1 foot off the body, 2 feet off the body, 10 feet off the body. We'd cleared it around my mother. We'd cleared it around just nothing seemed to be particularly changing after all of these endless meridian clearings. And I suggested maybe there's some other work to be done. But oh no, there was always another meridian to be cleared. And when I pointed out, having learned from a stranger in a cafe, that I had trauma and PTSD, in part from therapeutic abuse, and in part from family and cultural abuse, in part being a sensitive and an insensitive culture, and that I had been demonstrating traumatic symptoms. I had been freezing. I had been going into, fight-flight dynamics in the work. I had been describing traumatic symptoms in my life. And never once did the therapist recommend a book about trauma, tell me what trauma was, say that's a traumatic symptom, anything useful like that. And I said, this seems really shitty, because you said you could help, and it turns out the biggest issue I had was trauma. And you couldn't even recognize a traumatic symptom, let alone recommend a book or tell me to point me in the right direction. You just kept taking my money. 1. Number 2, I don't want you to do that to the next person. So number 3, I want to teach you what traumatic symptoms are and how to spot them so that the next person will not be so unfortunate. Well, he was not interested because, and this was Steve Orsery, he was not interested because trauma's not his thing. And this gets to the ethics of the inner world versus the outer world. So, all these healers will talk about, how important the inner world is. But you don't go to an ER room and have a broken bone presenting, with obvious things, and then be shunted off to a foot masseuse. The first step is to triage and to decide what the malady is and how to respond. What's out of whack and how to bring it back to whack. This is not how inner healers work. They do quite the opposite. You show up and they do their thing. You show up with a broken right elbow, and if they're a foot masseuse, they do foot massage. They don't say, oh my goodness, you've got a broken right elbow, go off and see so-and-so. They don't say, I'm the wrong person for you. I don't think there has ever been a person in the inner healing domain, in the inner therapeutic terrain, who has not thought that they were the best person for the job. Now, not a single one of them took intake forms except chiropractors. This is the biggest joke around. I don't get it. Chiropractors, network chiropractic, would give me 5 10-page questionnaires about stuff that had almost nothing, so far as I could tell, to do with my back being misaligned. I mean, do you have allergies to wheat? I mean, are you going to adjust my back differently because I have a wheat allergy than if I don't? No, but they ask that. So you have to hand it to chiropractors for, I remember with one chiropractor, it's like, I'll come to you as long as I don't have to fill out this 10-page form. It's, what is, aren't you going to look at my neck and back and tell me if I need an adjustment or not? Is that going to change based on whether I have nightmares or this? I mean, what is this about? So that was, on the one hand. But therapists, nada, nothing. Masseuses, somatic healers, nothing. No intake form. So they're flying blind. And they all think they're great, and they all say they're great, and they all say the same thing. Sometimes it takes a couple of sessions to see progress. It's just a coverall for the fact that, in that 30% statistic, a third are going to get better, a third are going to get worse, a third are going to stay the same. They're all going to pay, though. And the bit that I want to protect you from in mentioning this is the shame of failure. So you got it up through the cultural barrage of messages that you're weak and feminine because you needed help. And you earned the money to, seek help. And you went into the unknown, feminine terrain, and you asked for help, feminine terrain. And it may even be with a female, which may or may not bring up, again, another chauvinistic layer, because unfortunately, even though chauvinism is a lie, if you've been bombarded with enough of it, you will feel shame, even though there is no logical reason for feeling shame other than that if you are exposed to a barrage of cultural trauma, you will feel shame. Now, if it fails, if you go out having paid $300 and you feel worse, and you call the therapist and say, I feel worse, and they say, oh, that happens, come back and pay me another $300. If you say, that doesn't feel right, I'm not doing that, you're going to feel like a schmuck. Why? Because you paid $300 to feel worse. But also, the therapist didn't acknowledge that there's any of this on them. Nothing at all. The therapist is going to live in a reality and project a reality bolstered by the one-sided exposure, meaning you've explained all the ways that you're weak or a shit or something like that. So you've kind of outed everything that's shameful to work on because the therapist is going to dig for that. So now they've got all that on you. You don't have anything on them. They make it worse and charge you money. And then you tell them about it, and they give the message bolstered by this one-sided thing, like we all know you're a shit anyway. So it's no doubt that it's your fault if it didn't work out. If it didn't work out, it's your fault. It's not my fault that I didn't notice traumatic symptoms. It's your fault for coming to me in the first place. We did great meridian clearing. How was I to know that you needed traumatic help? I'm just a healer, And so this shame of failure is something that is particularly poignant for those of us who do deep, meaningful, sustained work. Meaning it's possible, and I've done it, to do 3 hours, three different therapies a week. So a 2-hour session on Monday with one practitioner, a 2-hour session on Tuesday or Wednesday with another practitioner, a 2-hour session on Friday with another practitioner. And you can do this week after week after week. I've done it. $25,000 a year is about what that'll cost you. And so you can do that for years. And then you can notice something at the end of 2 years of 6-hour-a-week healing, right? You can notice I feel more stressed. I feel more impatient. I feel more irritable than I did before. I feel more hopeless, meaning I have now confirmed that 2 years of 2 hours a week, 6 hours a week with 3 practitioners is taking me no closer to where I want to go than I was before. I've now confirmed that. So what's the obvious hypothesis? I mean, the pretty common sense is I'm screwed. Because if 3 practitioners, all of whom said they were going to help, are making it worse and charging large amounts of money to do it, 1. And 2, if stepping outside of the therapeutic container, you've just got a dysfunctional, illiterate culture that doesn't understand feelings, that doesn't understand or honor the feminine, that doesn't understand or honor trauma, and that doesn't teach other people how to have relationship skills, so that even if you learn relationship skills, you're still going to be effectively trying to play a good game of tennis with people that don't know how to hold their racket most of the time, which is irritating. Try improving your tennis game with people that, for the most part, can't even tell which way to hold their racket. And it is bound to be an irritating experience. And this culture teaches more people how to play tennis well than it teaches people how to have excellent relationships. In part because at least there's set rules to the game. You go into, the various areas where people are, quote, having excellent relationships, and one person's idea of excellence is to have as much sex as possible with as many people. They're doing great at that. It's just that that's not the rules you're trying to play by. Another person is trying to look good and be popular, and they're winning at that. It's just that's your goal is authenticity, and they're not they're not playing by the same rules you are, and the culture doesn't teach you to evaluate what the rules are, what the paradigm is for your relational game. So we're all playing different relational games without even having the level of sophistication needed to note and differentiate the games. You ask a typical person what your relationship game is. What's the goal? What's the paradigm? What are the rules? What's the end game? What are you playing for? And how are you going about it? And they have no idea. It hasn't even occurred to them that there are different rules, and different ways of playing the game. Or they may have a completely different paradigm in which it isn't a game. It's life. It's not a game. It's life. So then you realize, okay, you've got a paradigm in which it's a game. They've got a paradigm in which it's life. In your paradigm, there's the possibility of consciousness around strategy. In theirs, it just happens unconsciously. You realize you can't even talk about that because you're dealing with an emotionally illiterate culture. So how are you going to fix that at an energy healer's or at a masseuse's, etc.? Now, I talked about the abuse of a therapist. Now, when a therapist abuses you, it's 10 times worse because, the whole point is for them to protect, be the healthy masculine, and honor the feminine. So when my therapist sexually abused me under the influence of psychedelics and tore my feminine self to shreds, it reenacts the original traumatic wound at high leverage because psychedelics leverage the dynamic. Paying for it leverages the dynamic. The fact that it's a therapist and they tell you they know what they're doing leverages the dynamic. You already know your parents don't know what they're doing, but a therapist supposedly does, and they're supposed to fix it. So now you're in terrain where no therapist will touch it. Now, this is a very interesting dynamic in the therapeutic ethics domain, because if you reach out to 100 doctors and say, who wants to talk about, ethics and be on a documentary about good medicine and stuff, there's going to be some people in 100 doctors that want to talk and want to be on a good documentary, et cetera, et cetera. When I reached out to 100 therapists, no one wanted to be on a documentary about therapeutic abuse. No one wanted to be on a documentary about sexual abuse. No one wanted to be on a documentary about trauma. Well, these are the three key issues facing many of us. If you haven't had the good fortune to spend time with enough therapists to be abused, you may not have found that yet. But this is terrain you're going to face. Now, if therapists don't want to go public and talk about the issue, it means they're part of the cycle of secrecy. They're part of the denial pattern, and they're being paid by the cult and being given clients by the cult to keep mum about it all. And when you don't know something, and then you discover, I made a mistake, I shouldn't have paid that person, etc. There's a sense, again, of shame in making mistakes, of not knowing. A shame that because I went into this beautiful unknown of the feminine, and because everything didn't go well, I'm somehow defective. Because, again, the therapist doesn't give a refund, doesn't say it was all my fault, etc., etc. Now, you can then encounter a defensive therapist, because I've also explored this a little bit. For example, after I went to one therapist to help fix the other therapist, and he said, move on, there were several things that didn't feel good about his, quote, therapy. One, he'd recommended that I marry this woman who turned out to be a terrible partner, and that didn't feel good. And two, he didn't offer to help in any way around the sexual trauma and abuse, and I really needed help at that time, and that felt shaming. It's like when you don't have anyone in the culture showing up to help you, which when you have a dysfunctional family, if you go back to the family and say, someone's repeated the family system, and now I've paid to repeat the family abuse cycle, the family is in denial. They don't want to deal with it. It's like, what family cycle? No, go away from here. It's all your fault. So the therapist then gangs up to say it's your fault. The family then gangs up to say it's your fault. And I actually dealt with this with my family. And so it's really important for a therapist to offer support and other resources, books, support groups, etc., to help the client deal with the overwhelming trauma of isolation, shame, sexual abuse, this whole thing of, I thought you were here to help me, the trust, the broken trust, etc. So this therapist didn't offer any of that. And when I talked about the fact that this was a school, the Human Awareness Institute, is a school for teaching people about loving, healthy relationships and healthy sexuality, and that it was a high therapist who had sexually abused me. When I talked about that, he didn't say, how can we report these people to the police? He didn't say, how can we protect the next person from abuse? He didn't say anything to indicate any interest at all other than the person paying him. Presumably, if High continues to sexually abuse clients, then they can show up and pay him more money to fix the issue. And so it's a cash cow. The more therapists out there abusing other people, the more it's a cash cow for the other therapists, who then get paid to fix it and keep it all under wraps. And when I went back to him, this was it Peter DeVries of Constellation Works. When I went back to him And I left a long message saying I'd like to talk with you and clear this up. Took him a week to get back, and he called and he said, when would you like to schedule another session? I said, no, I don't want another session. I want to clear stuff up from our work before. I said, do you have time now? He says, no. I said, okay. When do you have time? He said, oh, I'm very busy. Not too busy to schedule another session, of course, just too busy to, to do this. And I said, okay, so call me anytime you have free time. I'm around a lot because I'm dysfunctional from the PTSD. He never called. So then I wrote to him and I said, this seems shitty. You didn't listen, you didn't honor the message, you didn't show up to talk, you didn't follow up. And I'm now doing a documentary about therapists. He was part of the impetus to do a documentary documenting all the different areas of therapeutic ethics and negligence that are just constantly being dumped on the client for money. Now, he ignored that email. And so I then sent him. I said, you're doing constellations, about 6 months later. I said, you're doing constellation work about integrated systems. Do you somehow feel that you have nothing to do with my system? That I have no place in your circle, and that's why you're committed to avoiding this issue? And he said, I'm not committed to avoiding the issue. And I said, here's all your emails that are avoiding this issue. And things got a little testy back and forth. And I thought, this is not what I want the next client to experience. Because I'm dealing with what I would call a therapeutic defense structure. But a traumatized paying client should not have to deal with their therapist bullshit. The therapist needs to support the client, not the other way around. And this can easily get reversed with sensitives because they can feel that the therapist is not resourced, is not knowledgeable, and is insecure. And the therapist is going to be nasty if the client pushes too much. And this is one of the reasons why I've gotten so little out of therapy. There's not a solid container to fall into. Now, so Peter begins to get, testy around a variety of things. And I said, look, Peter, I'm going to make a website where all of our email and phone and and stuff is going to go up there because I think this is shitty protocol for responding to abusive therapy. Shitty protocol. And I want your next client to know. So I'm going to create a website about it. And furthermore, I would like you to bring in a mediator. You are not doing a good job here. Bring in a mediator of your choice who can hold space for you so I don't have to. He ignored that. And so I said, okay, website up. I sent him the website link. And then he responds and says, the reason I'm not working with you is that you're a pedophile. And I should build a website about your business calling you a pedophile. It's like, okay. Now, maybe I'm trying to think, okay, what has given you this idea? But this is what you have to deal with from your therapist. And now, he finally said, I'm very sorry, I must have hurt you in some way. But again, that's fine with me. I'll keep the money, you keep the hurt. And we move on, having been called a pedophile. No offer of mediation, no comprehension of the gap. And so this is a terribly miserable safety net underlying many therapeutic relationships. And it is glossed over by the pleaser in many therapeutic patients. Oh, you're wonderful. Oh, let me give you a little tip. Oh, I'm feeling so much better as I get in the car and feel depressed again. And there's this dynamic where I'm going to please the incompetent power structure by telling them they're wonderful and I'm going to pay them. And then I'll get a little pat on the back that I'm making great progress even though years can go by and I'm not feeling any better. And so this is a contract that exists where the abusive parent becomes the abusive therapist, only you're now paying for stupidity as opposed to, being raised by idiotic parents. This, of course, brings new loneliness. Do you want to start a new therapeutic relationship, that one bastion of safety and safe harbor in a domain? Do you want to start a new therapeutic relationship with someone who's probably going to do the same thing? Start with the promise that they're going to help, whether they do or not. Start with the one-sided exposure. Start with you making all the effort to drive to them and show up on time and expose the same wound again. Go away feeling shame of failure if it doesn't work a good third of the time. Potentially be abused and know that you will be defensively refused any refund, and that all that talk about how wonderful you are was only on condition that you not talk about any of the shitty therapeutic practices. This is incredibly lonely. Now, one of the core childhood wounds, at least, that I dealt with was feeling that my feelings were unwanted. Now, the therapist, Peter Sandhill, who sexually abused me, wanted nothing to do with my truth, which kind of feels familiar to the family system. The family system wants nothing to do with my truth. So my truth is, this hurts, I don't like that, why are you doing this, don't do this instead. That's fought by the therapist. You're hurting me, you're making it worse, you're abusing your power. That's also fought. No, Peter Sandhill said, this has nothing to do with me. You see, and so as a result of telling the truth, or at least a truth, now the therapeutic patient is unwanted again. And once you're in the hurt, small, feminine place that was created in the initial wounding with the parent, one is now deeper than ever in the feminine wound, because it is the feminine who is abused by the therapeutic patient, or the therapist, because the therapeutic patient is in a feminine position. I'm learning, I'm being guided by, I'm being influenced by a professional in emotional terrain. That is a 100% feminine position. So the 100% feminine position is violated as the therapist fails to take responsibility for the care and love of the feminine and champion it. In the most basic ways. Peter Sandhill showed up late without any communication for the first integration session of the psychedelic thing. It's a betrayal of container. It's like giving birth to a baby and then showing up late to give the baby its first milk. It's like, and I didn't want to call it. That's just the feminine domain. It's not important within the dogma and chauvinism of the culture. Now, as soon as you're in the really hurt, small, helpless, dissociated place of the feminine, you are set to be bullied, ignored, shamed, humiliated, isolated, and unhelped by the entire cult. Because as soon as I go from being the competent guy who travels wherever he wants to go, runs a business, has achieved thousands of goals, all masculine traits, can do this, is quite competent in this domain and this domain and this domain. As soon as we go from my masculine strengths, where I get applauded regularly, into the wounded feminine, in this case wounded by my therapist, I am again unlovable, unwantable, shameful, and to be ignored. And one can test this when one sends out emails and says, I've been sexually abused by a therapist, anyone in this whole circle of group can help, etc. And they're like, yeah, get over it, go forgive him, do this, do that, the other. And it's like no one wants to come up and actually see what you need. Now, when when the therapeutic buddies at the Human Awareness Institute who had trained and referred him to me said it wasn't their issue, there's another message of shame, but there's also the message you're not safe in this whole community. So your whole community is sacrificed on the altar of protecting a therapist from incompetence. And so there's now the cultural betrayal. And finally, all of this wounding, the hurt, the betrayal, the lies, the hopelessness, the exhaustion of doing this over and over and over again by one incompetent practitioner after another, none of whom, of course, have any fault in the matter. The exhaustion of it all takes me into my deepest pain, my deepest despair, my deepest rage, my deepest hate, my deepest loneliness, my deepest scarred, hurt, small, feminine self, in which I feel completely worthless. Now, this is when the betrayal of the New Age spiritual critic raises a hand and says, oh, that's self-pity. You shouldn't feel that. You are a responsible adult who should be taking charge of their life. That's when Norman Vincent Peale, with success with a positive mental attitude, pipes up and says, make lemonade out of lemons. You've just been sexually abused by your therapist. You've just been ignored and ostracized by all your other therapists. You've just been completely abandoned by your culture. You're now spending money hand over fist to try and cope because you can't work. Make lemonade out of lemons. Turn this into a positive. It's like there's nothing positive about this. I don't know if I'm going to live. I'm in so much pain. And the critic does not bow down and say, you're right. It seems incredibly painful and negative. Norman Vincent Peale is wrong. And the Lazarus critic of, you created this. You create your own reality consciously. You consciously wanted to be sexually abused. So it's all your beliefs. There's nothing to do with the lack of training or anything like that of Peter Sandhill. No, it's your beliefs. You. Now, I thought I did plenty of belief work, but no, I fucked up in that area as well. You see, because I apparently missed the belief that if I really trusted a therapist, they would sexually abuse me. I didn't see it. My mistake, right? And the rage that induces this continual dumping of criticism, blame, shame on the feminine over and over and over and over and over again until even the highly paid therapists blame me for their incompetence, to be topped only by the spiritual critic up here who says, yeah, you must have, had some dark agenda about this and that and the other, and this is great spiritual teaching for you, etc. And it's like, fuck you. Fuck you. So now we have the whole then cultural judge about that kind of anger. Fuck you. Oh, there's an angry guy, right? He's not safe. Now this whole sick sociopathic spiral, that's perfectly all right. But the man that gets angry about this, something off about that guy. Now, we're not going to say it out loud because that would be courageous and authentic and cruel, but at least it would be candid and sane. No. We're just not going to invite that angry guy over because he's angry. He's not looking at the positive spiritual side like all of us. And so let's not, we won't even ask him how you doing? How you doing? What's positive in your life? I've been sexually abused by my therapist. I can't cope. I need help. All right, got to go. I'll make a note not to ask that person how they're doing again. Cheerio, good luck. And off they go. And there is this cowardice in dealing with the impact of a dysfunctional cult that is grinding out sexual abuse molestation, therapeutic abuse, emotional abuse, tyranny towards the feminine in men and women, by men and by women. By the hour, it's grinding it out in an entire culture. And when people have the audacity to honor their feminine enough to speak about the anger, to speak about the hurt, to speak about the shame, and to tell the dirty secret. You see, because the dirtiest secret and the most taboo dynamic of all in this cult is it has nothing to do with the individual. Meaning, if you take 300 million people, and then, 150 million men, you take 150 million boys, and you run them through this protocol, you are going to have a majority of men with an unhealthy relationship with their feminine side, in one form or another. The vast majority. You're going to have a majority of men that's dealing with undiagnosed and untreated trauma, with undiagnosed and untreated shame, with various forms of isolation and loneliness. Now, the very man who desperately needs to claw out of these statistics, which are horrendous, and seeks another man, like, get these women out of my face. I don't want sex and anything. I want someone that I can trust that doesn't have an agenda. And all the men have the same agenda. Keep away from my feminine self. Don't reveal that I have a wounded feminine self inside me. Pretend that you don't either. Let's pretend that nothing's going on so that we can be cool, so that we can be accepted, so that we can be higher on the sociopathic continuum and get fucked by a cult that is constantly barraging men with the message that that's all men want to do. That is not all that I want to do. Give an example, the best relationship of my life, other than with my wife at present, was with a woman twice my age, with no sex chemistry, and we didn't have sex. And I chose her over the woman with whom I had sex 3 to 4 times a day that was the best sex of my life, meaning having spent time with 100 female lovers, this woman was 300%, she had it at a physical, sexual level, the best sex of my life. And I had to choose between a woman I had no sex with, but a deep, meaningful emotional connection. And this woman, which I knew I am probably never going to meet a woman that is so responsive, that wants me so much, that arouses me so much, where the sex is so pleasurable, but it feels like a drug. It feels like a drug, and this over here, this friendship with no sex, is real. Now, the woman with the great sex was jealous of the emotional connection, but she wouldn't commit to co-create the emotional connection. I said, fine. You show up, you prioritize the relationship emotionally, and I will be in heaven. But she didn't want to. The physical sex was enough. She didn't want to be more conscious. She didn't want to grow. She didn't want to honor her femininity. So I chose the woman with no sex. But I have been told 10,000 times that men are just interested in sex. Well, nothing could be further from the truth if I'm choosing the best sex of 100 fabulous lovers and an emotional connection. Why is it that this aspect of masculinity, the healthy masculine, is so invisible, so lied about, and so discounted? Now, what do I mean by discounted? I can tell that story to 100 women. They don't believe a word of it. No, you're just saying that so that you can have sex with me. It is so self-referential and narcissistic. You're not breaking up with me because I don't reply to my emails on time. I don't prioritize answering the phone. I don't want to talk about meaningful subjects. No. You've found someone with nicer legs, haven't you? You've found someone younger. She's got bigger tits than me. I know. I know how men are. No, you don't. You are so dumb, you don't even know that you're dumb. You are so narcissistic, you don't even know you're narcissistic. And that's an even better reason to leave. I could give a shit about your body. Yes, it's nice. But really? Over good conversation? Over honesty and integrity and authenticity? Over being championed and able to talk about all my feelings? You're going to put tits and ass? Buying into the chauvinism of a cult that has told you that your value is breast size and pertness? And you believe that shit? Hook, line, and sinker. And so I end up being tarred and feathered as someone interested in sex when I leave a relationship, not because of the sex, but because of the inner working, because of the feminine dynamic. And most women cannot imagine a man, having been prescribed what men are, who actually cares about their feminine side and their own. So this becomes a continual whitewashing of this entire pattern, meaning a narcissistic, sociopathic, chauvinistic woman is never going to ask about any of this, is never going to believe any of it if I volunteer it, and is going to whitewash the entire thing into a narcissistic equation that says that whatever it is that I'm saying and doing, I am saying and doing to have sex with her. And that her sex is something that is a prize. Meaning my feminine self, who shows up with love, I have zero interest in sex without love. So my feminine self, which shows up with love, has no value in that equation. I am a manipulative sociopath in that equation who has no value, but who must perform and pay money, etc., in order to earn what has value, which is the female body. It's all chauvinistic. The entire equation is chauvinistic. And then since my heart has no value, when I end up communicating more than the woman, cooking more than the woman, bringing art into the relationship more than woman, bringing growth into the relationship, initiating, protecting more than the woman, that's all devalued. But it's paid attention. Did you pay for the dinner, or did you expect me to do something? Well, I just had sex with you. I just assumed that since your inner life has zero value and men don't love and all that, that you would at least be paying for dinner. So when this gets self-referential in a woman, they don't doubt it. It's just, you don't exist. I don't exist as a feminine self in the sociopathic eyes of many chauvinistic women who have devalued their own feminine essence and just value their body, and who have completely whitewashed my feminine and true masculine essence to project a sociopathic sex strategist onto me that needs to be bought with hard work and suffering, which is reflected in the rudeness and the callousness and the boredom with which they respond to sincerity, because it's not sincere in their world. And this is highlighted in the San Francisco Bay Area. It's one of the reasons that I met my wife in the Philippines, where there isn't this facade of chauvinistic cynicism. So this is the end of the road, and the question is, how can we empathize with the fact that there is not a man in America who has not experienced some of this wounding to some degree. And that there are very few men in America who have the resources to grieve, to cry, to weep, to talk about the amount of unimaginable pain stored in this wound. And that the cult has pathologically betrayed men by whitewashing the entire dynamic with the pretense that guys are just guys that don't want to feel, that don't have feelings, that can't talk about their feelings, having been shamed and humiliated and abandoned and traumatized and then shamed again and then not taught anything about feelings. Surprise, surprise, men can't talk about feelings. Women have the biology and in the period and the menstruation and stuff that brings them more into feelings cathartically. And so they have an edge. And then women, for some reason, are not shamed for seeking affection with other women. They can walk hand in hand and giggle and talk and stuff, which are healthy rapport-building dynamics. As soon as a guy does that, he's marginalized as feminine, called gay, and seen as a little suspect and to be avoided by anyone who wants to be high-ranking in a chauvinistic culture. This is the wound. And the purpose of outlining this wound is not to say that the entire situation is completely hopeless. It's not to say, therefore, men have the right to punish and abuse women and blah, blah, blah. It's not to say, therefore, there's no hope and, just give up on life. Though many men are committing suicide in middle age in America. It's to say that men need a tremendous amount of love, a tremendous amount of empathy of human beings, male or female, but preferably male, who understand what's going on and why, who understand that it's not the little boy's fault for being born into a cult this sick, and that understands that even though men on the machismo masculine side may benefit in all of this terrain, the machismo sociopathic sex addict, for example, in men may benefit and feel fine about all of this spiral of abuse, that there is a feminine self in every man buried 8 feet deep, buried 20 feet deep down in the bottom of a well, walled off and frozen in ice, unconscious behind a black wall with a written hard law that says never go behind this wall. Whatever goes and is beyond that wall is evil and it's not me. Despite all of the sociopathic distance from the wounded feminine, every single human male in the history of the species has had a feminine self. And those who have no sense of it, no consciousness of it, have it on ice. It may be frozen. It may be numb. One may be in a sociopathic state. But that doesn't mean that once the painkiller wears off in part of the journey of wholeness and authenticity, that man will not be in as shitload of pain as anyone else who is beginning to experience the thawing of the feminine self, who once thought and once integrated with dignity and beauty and a balance, a healthy symmetry of masculinity and femininity, has the possibility of leading us into a new world, a healthier world, a saner world, a more beautiful world. And so the purpose of this is not about how to pile on, shame and criticism to the incompetence of our cult, though that can be healthy to externalize that hostility rather than take it in. Because shame is about saying it's all my fault. And what this is saying, look at the statistics. Look at the statistics. How many healthy men, as a percentage of 100, is this cult raising? That has nothing to do with the individual. That's the protocol. And this is the sick protocol that's setting most men up to fail. It's why most men in this cult will die misunderstood, lonely, feeling dissociated, feeling mildly insane, feeling ashamed, without a single true relationship in which they are deeply known and loved inside or out. And that's a tragedy. Now, we cannot empathize with men if we say it's all in your head, it's your fault, you're creating your own reality, blah, 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 blah. We can empathize with men as we follow the tapestry of our cult's yellow brick road. First you go here, then you get here, then you get here, and you see, gee, there's not really any great liberation point. Line up 100 people who have done therapy and say, well, how many people have you just kind of really broke through and had a wonderful thing? Well, in Timothy Leary's study, maybe a third got better, and 5% of those just had a real breakthrough moment. That's great for those 5%. But what about the rest who spent all that money, et cetera, and got worse or stayed the same, and then were shamed and blamed by their therapist with the message, well, it worked on the other guy. Very much like a doctor might say, if you look at the sampling and the statistics, you have a few people who don't have enough salt and they sweat a lot. You have a few people that, or you have a majority that eat a lot. So you could have a doctor that just dispenses, don't cut out the salt. Whatever you say, I would like help, and they say, cut out the salt. Well, you have the people who don't have enough salt, and it nearly kills them. Too little sodium and you die. Too much sodium and you die. You can't just say, well, it worked for the other guy. You have to do a diagnosis and get to know the individual. So I hope this has been helpful in empathizing about you. My greatest honor would be that you come away seeing parts of yourself in this journey. 1. And that 2, that those parts of you that are lonely, buried, isolated, and feminine are validated. 3, that the shame that was given to you by a dysfunctional cult is put back where it belongs, on the shoulders of the cult. And 4, that you have empathy, as I have empathy, for you and your journey.